Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stephen Hobbs, co-director of the Trinity session. I'm here to moderate today's panel, Open Streets, Culture and the City. And I'll start with just a brief introduction around the framing of the panel. Stories of urban renewal and heritage, rediscovery, rub shoulders in this panel devoted to discussing culture's potency to transform. Is culture the right tool to enhance the urban fabric or reignite forgotten heritage sites? Or is it unfairly instrumentalized, perhaps creating exclusion over inclusion? So I think to quote a phrase from Wilma's introduction earlier, I want to start with a perspective from some of the work that I'm involved in. And I was interested in the phrase dialogue based on participation. So as an artist, primarily, I find that my work 9 times out of 10 is about communicating the meaning. And there is an argument, you might say, that an artist doesn't necessarily have to defend their intention or what their work is about. But in a country like South Africa with 11 official languages and a wide spectrum of cultural diversity and ethnicity, the business of finding new language to communicate ideas and make connections is essential. So the title of our panel, Open Streets, sparked for me an interest in the movement Open Streets, which a festival started in North America and reaches the world. And if one visits the actual site, there is the most phenomenal toolkit that is available to cities to actually implement the Open Street Festival in your own domain. I'm going to actually quote, I should say, or read from a publication, Learning with Damaged Colonial Places, Post-Humanist Pedagogies from a Joburg Preschool, a publication put together by Teresa Magdalene Jorza, a close collaborator. So this will frame a little bit about what you see on the screen. The 2 images here are of Open Streets festivals in other cities. The City of Johannesburg has a lively and innovative public art program effected through their Johannesburg Development Agency, the JDA. The JDA's 3-year partnership with art activist organization, the Trinity Session and partners, has generated the creative program Art My Josie, which describes its work as creative placemaking through processes of community participation and co-production. They have already impacted on the physical spaces of the city, inviting public participation and storying to enliven the upgraded public transport networks being established across the city. The Open Streets event, held in Auckland Park, Brixton, in April 2019, was initiated by teachers at Mimosa, a local school in collaboration with the City of Johannesburg Region B and Art My Josie. The pedagogical leaders of Mimosa School are part of the Africa Reggio Emilia Alliance area and contribute to its ongoing work with Gauteng practitioners, Gauteng, the province within which Johannesburg is based, Gauteng practitioners in partnership with the Provincial Education Department. In preparation for the Open Streets Day, the Mimosa children and teachers embarked on a research project into streets in general and their own street in particular. They interviewed neighbors and passers-by. They met and interviewed waste collectors and recyclers, part of an organized movement of self-employed reclaimers. They followed their own thoughts about what was going on beneath the soil and under their feet, down the drains and through the cracks. Art My Josie worked with the children to explore, through art making, the meaning of streets and to enact different ways of being street users. Their work formed part of the public display on the day of the Open Streets event. Currently, our public open spaces and their colonial histories assume certain well-established patterns of life. Living and learning and construct children as passive users of these spaces. But there are ways to disrupt these patterns and follow energetic lines of flight that leap over the wall, going against the grain of the usual once-off city-led events. This particular Open Streets activation was more slowly steeped. There was a more gradual seeding among the children, their teachers, the neighbors, and the various city officials who attended weekly meetings in the lead up to the day. Co-productive activations like the Open Streets events and the participatory placemakings of Art My Josie begin to materialize Achille Mbembe's assertion that decolonization has to do with taking public space taking back public space, excuse me. Events like these suggest that a closer engagement between city officials and early childhood development centres, with the help of creative post-age practices of philosophical play and art-based methodologies, could generate a far more collaborative co-production as a way to explore new forms of what Dunn, Malone and Tazar call children urban nature assemblages. The life worlds of participants need to find cracks through which to leak and flow so that local indigenous knowledges of the importance of place and relation with place can emerge. Now, in all of that reading, I neglected to show my slides because I'm not as dexterous as some of the presenters, I suspect. So I will just simply share the location of the site in Auckland Park, a very, very localized section there. As you can see, the roads highlighted in red. The mapping out of all of the activities conceived through the collective co-productive engagement process with local residents, city, the aspirations and dreams for what could manifest in the streets, and some of the aspirations of the young learners from the Mimosa School. So this is the kind of activity map that you would have experienced on the day. And just an example of the kind of use of exhibition as a way of engaging local community and residents to look at future projects that are in the making and have an opportunity to respond publicly to the strengths and weaknesses of the thinking and so forth. So, with that, thank you very much. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the day, Antonio Carver, Director of Art Jameel, United Arab Emirates, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and a thank you also to everyone at Al Sakal, Abdul Manem, Vilmer, Fizza, Bernice, all the team, and also to everyone at World City. Thank you for having us today. I'm going to very quickly introduce the two centres that Art Jameel runs. Art Jameel is a foundation, an independent foundation with a wholly civic purpose. And as you mentioned, we're based in Jeddah and in Dubai. So just to very quickly introduce what we do and then move on to a kind of really trying to think through relationships with audiences and communities and how to build a kind of critical relationship with those. So part of the mapping exercise that we did when we moved from being an agency model working for the last 25 years into a model that had its own centres was to really think, what does each city that we work in need? What's there already, and how can we really add to what's there rather than replicate or reinvent any wheels out there? So, I mean, everybody who's from Dubai in this audience will know that Dubai is home to major events such as Art Dubai. It also has, in the region, one of the most developed commercial art scenes with all the galleries that are here in Al Sakal, but it lacked a kind of flexible, mid-scale museum-type model that acted both as a Kunsthalle type model, but also one with a collection. So we felt this is where we can really contribute something by bringing such an institution to the city. Just to quickly, my slides are not particularly glamorous looking, but forgive all the labels. But just to give an idea of what we do, we're involved in exhibition making. We have 3 floors of exhibitions, working sometimes with our collection, sometimes with others. We also have 7 desert gardens with quite a focus on working with indigenous plants and thinking through sustainability issues through our gardens. A sculpture park. Anyway, anyone that hasn't been there, please come anytime. We're free, and that's very important to us, that people really treat it as a home from home for the arts community. Just moving on to what we do in Jeddah. So we haven't announced it yet, but on December the 6th is our first opening day of our new season opening, Hi Jameel in Jeddah, which is, again, thinking what did Jeddah need primarily. The government in Saudi, and we'll probably come on to that with my colleagues, are working on major developments. We felt as an independent institution, one of the few NGOs working in the arts at the moment in Saudi, and hopefully to be joined by many others, what we could do is build a multidisciplinary kind of meeting point for the arts. In Jeddah, there's a huge creative community, but maybe everyone working slightly in isolation from each other. Obviously, doesn't need to be said, but for many years, people have been working slightly from behind closed doors. So this was a way to bring everyone together. The building is designed by YY, who curated the UAE National Pavilion at Venice this year and won the Golden Lion, which we're very excited about, following Bahrain's footsteps. So this is their first major public building, which we're hugely excited about. And the architecture itself, the architectural intent, really sets out what we want to do within this space. So you can see it's a kind of U-shaped development with a centralised block. The centralised block is High Arts. High, by the way, for people who don't speak Arabic, is a word that kind of connotes neighbourhood. So it's this idea of really thinking through a creative neighbourhood and how to bring people together. Again, like what we try to do in Dubai, this kind of home from home kind of attitude. It includes the first independent cinema in Saudi, 2 floors of exhibition space in High Arts, studios, and it's home to High Learning, which is our community arts school, which has been running for some time in Saudi and now kind of doubles down in what it's doing. And it's also home to what we call High Residence, which are like-minded creative enterprises and businesses that have grown up in Jeddah and now coming here to have a home. So it's a really kind of multifunctional space in which we want to pool all these different audiences. People will come, you know, because they're devotees of the Saudi Comedy Club. They'll pass by some galleries, they'll engage with artists working in studios, and it's really about bringing that all together in one space. Just moving on to, maybe I'll just leave that slide for now. Just moving on to what I wanted to talk about today was really trying to hone in on the potency of culture and arts developments and institutions to transform cities and societies through their approaches to building critical and participatory relationships with their audiences and with community. When we think about community, and especially over the past year, which Vilma alluded to already, you know, we think about digital communities, those who will never physically come to the institution, something that's particularly important in our region where many people cannot travel for various reasons to do with having the right visa or passport or being in a functioning place that enables you to travel, but also those kind of super users, the people that come daily and really treat that institution as a home from home. So when we think about cultural developments and the place of art in the urban fabric, we tend to think about developments, bricks and mortar, which is obviously hugely important. That's where you're able to bring together people physically, where you can build production and display of work. But alongside this is the kind of conceptual glue, if you like, that can transform a space from one that serves tourists and maybe is partly an image maker for that city or that country, into one that really is imagined through public participation. It's how institutions and cultural developments interact with and embrace their community that can really transform those institutions from one that delivers programs to one that co-thinks with its public and that invites responses and really facilitates true engagement. So a fundamental building block in imagining Jameel Arts Centre, and we're trying to do the same in Saudi as well, is to really embrace this idea of thinking in public. So not only to rely on strategy plans that are created behind closed doors, but to really try and expose thoughts in progress in the public realm. So to be able to do this, the institution really needs to expose its own vulnerabilities and to embrace the idea of radical doubt, to really invite and give confidence to the public to challenge its ideas and programs and its very existence. Sometimes this can be a little bit of a hard idea to sell to stakeholders and funders who tend to sort of think in terms of certainties, and that's what we have to deliver. But this kind of thinking obviously marks a distinct change compared to the institutions of old. And some, you know, and so still some being built now. Museums were, of course, places where the visitor tends to adopt a passive attitude. You go to be taught, to absorb, to receive answers rather than to necessarily ask questions. So to flip this around and to really think about the idea of the institution as somewhere that could be challenged used to be really sort of something quite unthinkable. And this way of thinking also aligns with a new concept of what history is and how history is recorded and made. not as a single canon of perceived wisdom, but instead as a weave of multiple histories and of contested narratives. And I think if you haven't been to Ishara Art Foundation here in Al Sakal, please do, because that really, for me, that institution really embodies this kind of thinking. And this is also partly caused, this shift is partly caused by the opening up of understanding in the West that there was always a complex relationship with other parts of the world, and that those sites that were seen as places to be mined for traditions or knowledge or artifacts themselves were in fact active sites where history was always being made in an active rather than passive way. It's very obvious that, of course, this story tended to be one-sided, at least in terms of dominance of storytelling through museums and also through urban and cultural developments. This can be macro, we talk sweepingly of East and West, but also very micro kind of encounters. So to use a local example, one of our kind of key artists here in the UAE, Hassan Sharif, we all know that he went to study in London, attended by, I'm sure, a School of Art. And what's very well documented is the journey of going and coming back and bringing back perceived knowledge. But what perhaps needs to be flipped around and really analysed now, and I hope someone out there is doing their PhD on this, is what was the impact of artists who went from this part of the world to schools in London and Paris and elsewhere? How did they influence what was being taught and thought about in those kind of environments? So to turn to this idea of what does an institution look like if it turns itself inside out, if it lays bare its questions and invites an audience in to solve them together. This feels particularly apt and urgent in a culture like ours, which is actively being made and actively thinking about the future and thinking about what kinds of society it wants to be. It's really apt also in places that are thinking, how do we transform our societies from parallel sets of ethnicities and experiences into societies of explicit plurality? Where do we think about shifts that are taking place from one generation to the next? When those shifts are kind of seismic, it becomes even more urgent for the arts and culture institutions to step up and allow spaces where these kind of debates can actively take place. And it's also super important in spaces where histories tended to be oral rather than necessarily set down in kind of canonistic kind of ways, where history could be vernacular or told by outsiders. So now there's an urgent need for histories to be told and retold in collaborative ways. So by taking this approach, we in the culture and arts industry can play an active role in shaping what kind of society we want to live in and what we see our future to be. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time. I can't see Fizzer. Yeah, okay. I think I have a little longer, right? A few more minutes.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay, right. I'm on a race. So just to give a very quick example of how this thinking can actually be manifest not only in talk, but also in programming. I thought I'd give an example from our project space in Al Sakal. We were really kindly hosted by Abdulmanem and Vilmer in 2017, 2018. Before we moved into our building, we had our project space here, and we did all sorts of experiments to try and understand what our future would look like in our new institution. It really helped us a lot. So this was a program, for example, that I'm showing on the screen now, Annotations. It was curated by Uns Katan and Nadine Khandour, 2 members of the team. And the idea was to take an experimental kind of approach to presenting research and work in progress in the public realm, and to invite scholars and practitioners to come and show their research and to challenge a local community and audience to almost, come back and be part of that research and contribute back to it. This is now called Library Circles in our new centre in Jameel. Sorry, excuse me. And this public studio, we were looking at the period of the kind of early 80s in the UAE. We took an interview between Khaled Al-Badour and Nujum Al-Ghanam, a poet and an artist, and unpicked that interview and dissected it around the walls of the space. We then connected through actual red threads and different coloured threads across the space, the different connections that existed between the archives, the contributions of artists, and the words in this interview. We then invited the community in and the public in to try and contest this history. Is that what they remembered? We actually asked people, if you don't agree with what we've done here, please take a thread and rethread it, and contest this history that we're setting out, because we know it's not one history, it's just part of, again, this very complex kind of weave of histories. And we did various kind of talks, and luckily for us, you know, a lot of the response was quite combative. People said, I didn't remember it like this, actually. You know, I think you've got this wrong. You've forgotten this figure, you've forgotten that. And we tried to sort of document that and add it into the research as we went along. So more articles and more archives were pasted on the walls as we went. Another factor in, sorry. So one factor in why we want to operate in this way it's quite selfish. It's also about fulfilling our own mandate. It's about creating impact that's of qualitative nature as well as a quantitative nature. So all of us that work in arts institutions and try to scrabble around for our funding will know we're often judged on the two Fs. It's all to do with footfall and fundraising. So I think this is, you know, been the kind of shift away from this model has perhaps been accelerated by the pandemic, like so many things, where relying on numbers doesn't necessarily work in today's world. So we've been trying to think about, what about quality of engagement? What about if interacting with exhibitions or our library or our projects can also have a transformative effect on that individual or those group of individuals? And how do we measure this? How do we measure impact? How do we know that if coming to see an exhibition has actually changed your worldview, has made you think differently about your place in society and in community, and how you feel about your own future and that of a kind of the glue that binds us all together? So this thesis is about opening up a space for debate that by setting out not to have the answers, but instead to inspire questions and to invite the public to respond or even disagree, then we're aiming to create a depth of engagement that makes the arts really matter. Vilma mentioned the making and unmaking of cities, and you know, maybe this can be done by communities themselves. We're vessels that provide the context for which communities can really challenge this. And the quote that Sheikh Hala showed by Sheikh May about the attention of the people, I really loved that at the end. And I think this is about capturing the attention of people, but also asking them for action. So then if we do this, the cultural sector has a real reason to be. You know, we're not here to necessarily just show something beautiful, but also, or making an area in a city hip or desirable, but we're really about gaining ourselves a place at the table that thinks fundamentally about building community-generated histories and how we live together and how we interact with each other. And that way we'll build more adaptive, stronger and resilient spaces and cities which are critically engaged and that are preserved for generations to come. That's it from me, but I hope I just about made it in my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonia. I'm really concerned with the business of a complementary approach, perhaps through a heightened interdisciplinarity or even a transdisciplinarity in the spirit of adding to what's already there, which struck me at the beginning of your presentation. And with the footfall and funding agenda and the drive forwards, it can be very easy to forget that there's history there to begin with. And that often it's fundamentally intangible. And how do we unpack those traces and build from there? On that note, I'd like to introduce Adam Wilkinson, Chief of Heritage and Culture, Diriyah Gate Development Company, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much. And forgive me if I stand. I feel with all the extraordinary brain power on display here today, I need to get the blood going up into my own head so that I can at least keep up with what's going on around us. It's an absolute privilege to be here today and in front of an audience rather than in front of a screen as well, to talk through some of this wonderful provocation we've had, a provocation which is challenging us as to whether culture needs to be driven, whether it needs to be supported, or whether it needs to happen in urban places, or whether, in fact, we should just step away from it entirely. So I'm going to take us back to the dream time. I'm going to take us back a long way in time. This is a diagram. Take a moment to try and absorb it. I have known this diagram for about 20 years, and I'm still trying to absorb it. But what it's attempting to do is consider how the Aboriginals in Australia look at the world. And they're looking at it in multiple ways. They're looking at it in terms of themselves, they're looking at it in terms of landscape, and they're looking in terms of the metaphysical, the spiritual as well. So fundamentally, mankind has a relation with landscape. And that's where I think we start with this. In our modern world of concrete and steel, we sometimes divorce ourselves from that landscape. In fact, we've done a very good job at divorcing ourselves from that landscape, but people create culture wherever they go. But what we're seeing here is that there's something fundamental in those links between the people and the place and how they interrelate to each other as well. This is so complex, you could think about it for days on end. So I'm going to try and make this a bit more real as we go deeper into my 4 or 5 minutes here. And we'll come over to London. This is a diagram that was put together by UNESCO as part of their Historic Urban Landscape Initiative. And what this is doing is looking at our places in terms of the layers. And you can apply this to anywhere. So in Diriyah, I look at Diriyah as a place that has multiple layers to its cultural landscape. We have at the base the geology, which takes us back deep in time, 250 million years to the Jurassic period of that limestone there. If I go out into the desert near Riyadh, I will find seashells, fossils of seashells in amongst that. Some really interesting shaped ones as well. I have found the beaks of ammonites or giant squid out there as well. This takes us back to times that you think about when you're a 9-year-old fantasizing about dinosaurs and amazing creatures eating each other. But we have that layer. Then we come up into the next layer. We come up to the hydrology, which is vital because it's the hydrology which has given life to that place and allowed life to prosper. How's that hydrology changed over time? Arabia was once green. It no longer is. We then come up into the soil which is fertile, which gives life, enables that life to happen, which has the archaeological remains within it, which tell us a story as well, going back who knows how many thousand years. And then we come through into the palm trees that grow from that, which are part of our cultural heritage, which provide the shelter for other things to grow. And then we layer onto that cultural practice, and above that, the environment. And you look at that through time, and you look at it into the future as well. And we suddenly have a relationship between the past, the present, and the future, a dialogue between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. That's powerful stuff when you start to think about places and how you shape them and how you form them. So in this diagram here, we're taking that down into a bit more detail, and it starts to ask some questions about how we shape places, whether it's just us as humans being in a piece of land, or whether it's when we're building cities, or even designing our own home, perhaps, how we might go about that in a way which reflects who we are. To take this somewhere else, I spent 12 years looking after the old and new towns of Edinburgh World Heritage Site. It's an extraordinarily complex and layered place, and you could spend an awfully long time exploring it from the fun side, but also a long time exploring it in terms of the dynamics of those relationships within an urban area such as this, and how they've come to be over time. But it's in this context that I want to sound a cautionary note about culture. Edinburgh has an incredible and amazing festival. That festival was a deliberate creation in 1945, after the war, to bring some cheer back to a cold, wet northern city. And a very beautiful city it is too. By about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, the festival, the giant festival, had come to the point where local people were starting to walk away from it. Why were they walking away from something which was so joyous and so amazing? Well, they were doing so because it prevented them from living their everyday lives. So in terms of the provocation as to whether cultural activity in urban spaces can stifle life, absolutely it can. Absolutely. But it wasn't the ones who suffered the most were in many respects the poorest, who couldn't get away. They couldn't go off on holiday during the festival to somewhere else. They couldn't use the post box because it had been blocked up during the festival, or it was too hard to walk to the local offices of the municipality because there were too many people on the streets. Simple, practical things. So these are some of the cautionary things we need to consider when looking at spaces. Yesterday, I went down into Al Khail Gate, which is an area in Dubai I'd never been to before. I went there to go and buy a guitar. A very old guitar imported from Japan in the 1970s to Dubai. There's probably an entire story and history behind that. But there I saw a place which was big new buildings with big numbers on them for what the block was. Like it was almost like a prison to that sort of extent. Quite a forbidding place. But the people there had turned it into something nice. They were outside on the streets, on the pavements, picnicking and enjoying life. There are people from all over the world gathering there, creating their own culture in their own space. There was nobody running a cultural program there, but there was plenty of culture to be had, regardless. And so to our development project in Deraya. We have at Tareif at the top left there, the World Heritage Site, a beautiful mud city which was laid siege to in 1818 by the Ottomans. And then we have this whole area here, which looks like just a blank development site. But it's not. When we go back to that Aboriginal idea, there are relationships between the people of this area and the land. We have Wadi Hanifa, going back to our layers, with the water within it, with the trees that grow there, the lower temperature. We have down here, there's a little dark spot. That dark spot is a rujum, a Bronze Age tomb. I've yet to excavate it. We'll do that in time. Archaeology is destruction, don't forget. And then across here, you can't quite see it, there's a camel path, which will be incorporated into the master plan as one of the routes. There's another tomb there, which will be in part of one of the museums. And so the past is influencing the present and shaping then how we'll act in the future as well as we use that footpath that's been used for thousands of years. So fundamentally, between development, people and places, there's a relationship, and a relationship which we can bring the best out of. This is how the master plan will look in the future. This isn't just a pretty picture though. At present, DGDA is building. On the left-hand side there in DG1, we have dug down, we are now building up and out. These are real things in real places that will reflect the culture of the place. That entire area to the left is being built out of mud brick. 180 million mud bricks will be used in the construction of that, reflecting that authenticity and that culture. So I'll leave these points on the provocation for you and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Adam, thanks very much. To your gorgeous and poetic introduction around the layers upon which we stand and build, and those relationships or interrelationships that hopefully spark greater sensitivity to how we envisage our planning. I have the honor and task of speaking on behalf of Brian Green, who, and I'll get to my point about layers in a second, unfortunately, and for those of you who have or haven't started traveling of late, it's no mean feat to get here, I have to tell you. Certainly coming from South Africa, we have some serious challenges in terms of testing and timing and all of that kind of thing, and I'm sorry that Brian couldn't make it. And I've been asked to speak a little bit on his behalf. The point I wanted to make, just to connect the business of layering to 44 Stanley, one of Group 44, Brian Green's early developments, nearly 20 years old, in Johannesburg, and now more recent Victoria Yards, which is probably around 4 to 5 years old. It's important to start with the simple fact that Johannesburg probably wouldn't exist today were it not for the discovery of gold in the late 1800s. Johannesburg is 2,000 meters above sea level. It has no significant natural water source, so why would you build a city there in the first place? To that end, Johannesburg has essentially a very, I suppose perhaps from an archaeological point of view, not entirely, because we have a profound archaeological and paleontological history, but in terms of the development of a modern city, there is a shallow history there. So I think that, and I suspect there's a slide to follow. Could we go to the next slide, or am I to prompt?
I've got a pointer. Do you want me to? Oh, okay.
Right, redefining the Joburg inner city landscape through building an ecosystem where tenants thrive as a community. Victoria Yards presents a uniquely integrated urban complex that is as much about social development as it is a commercial enterprise. A fresh take on inner city development. So, to use a phrase like culture-led urban regeneration, which has been bandied about in Johannesburg for quite some time, and we've been privy to that through our own work. It's very interesting to see when private developers bring a particular sensitivity to history and heritage and memory in the pursuit of exploring new products for Joburg citizens. Now, of course, we're in a post-apartheid era. We're 25 years into our democracy, and yet we are still confronted by serious challenges of integration and really equity. Access to public space, access to amenities, and access across the board for numerous communities in the country. So what is particular from my experience, and I can only speak from my experience because I'm not the developer, of Victoria Yards, is that it's my understanding that the development was predicated on a series of, you might argue, heritage buildings, insofar as some of them, as to the policy in Johannesburg, are older than 60 years. So in theory, you should not demolish, but you should add to. So the site itself has an early history, if you will, and is located in a peri-urban condition, just east of the city, in Bez Valley, Troyville, and pretty much a residential environment. And what's fascinating is that the adaptive reuse of these buildings, which is essentially with the pursuit of harnessing a kind of a new cultural offering within the area, has been very sensitive to the way that it recognizes the local community, the local labor force, and artists in the region. Artists as part social entrepreneurs, artists as activists, artists reimagining, particularly a younger generation, reimagining new futures for their artistic expression in the context of city making and Johannesburg itself. Johannesburg can be quite egotistical in its pursuits. It is still the kind of one of the richest cities on the continent, and we're very much driven by the industrial order of mining and so forth. So in a way, Victoria Yards is very antithetical to that, a soft space within the city. And what makes it, from my point of view, incredibly evocative as an environment is the dialogue between the public open spaces of the various studios and so forth, and the application of permaculture. So the local resident and worker base is instrumental in nurturing and maintaining that environment. You're surrounded by productive gardens. You could literally pick beans when you're entering an artist's studio or a cooperative space. Or yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I was picking chives out of the ground while nobody was looking. And there's something lovely about being able to taste the landscape while experiencing or having a conversation with an artist you may know or someone new that you're meeting. But it is that sensitivity. So while the site itself is essentially privately owned and therefore not so much gated, but has to control public flow and so forth, once inside that environment, there is a very tangible sense of the connection between food security, the philosophy of permaculture as a mechanism for respecting and preserving the Earth's surface, and ultimately providing a model of sustainability for the local community. I think I'll leave it there, if that's okay, Brian Green. You'll have to judge me when this is televised. Thank you so much. So, on that note, I forgot where I am. I'm swapping from Brian Green to Stephen Hobbs. Here I am. Thank you very much. I have to introduce now Samantha Ghosh, Artistic Programming Director, Royal Commission of Ulala, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. And thank you, Abdulmanem and Vilma, for inviting me today, and also Your Excellency, Sheikh Ahala, for a really inspirational keynote. Just before I start to talk about Al Ula, I wanted to just reflect on the interesting trajectory of Al Sakal. And we've seen how it's kind of moved from being a destination, which it still is, but it developed first as a destination. And I feel now the stage is it's becoming a centre of knowledge and a centre of debate and discussion. And that's actually really inspirational. So I think we've already seen a number of inspirational stories, but it's a real sort of cultural heart here of Dubai. I'm talking about artistic programming in a place called Al Ula. I'll tell you about that in a moment, but just to say what I mean by artistic programming, I'm talking about the range of activities that we are putting on in really a fairly remote part of Saudi Arabia, a place that's not actually a city, but that is a community. It's a community of around about 50,000 people, but one that's being developed into a major tourist destination that will welcome 2 million visitors a year by 2030. And by artistic programming, I take a multidisciplinary approach to programming, one that involves contemporary art, film, music, performance, and also one that's multisensory. So I'm looking at art installations that can work on the sense of smell, the sense of sound, of hearing, taste even. So as well as the visual, which is called the sort of prime mode of communication for artists today. Coming back to the place itself, Al Ula is about an hour and a half by air from Riyadh. It's close, but not that close to the Red Sea. You can see in the map in the bottom left there where it is. It's an area of about 20,000 square kilometers, so about a quarter the size of the UAE, almost the size of Belgium. So it's a vast space characterized by really stunning rock landscapes and desert, with running through the middle where the settlements are about 20 kilometers of fertile oasis valley. It's a place that the moment you land there, you're aware of an extraordinary presence of these rock formations and landscapes. It's also a region which has been characterized by 200,000 years of human development, creativity, and trade. And in the slide here, you can see on the far left there the tombs, the Dadanite tombs. 3 ancient civilizations had their cradle in Al Ula and the region. The Dadanites, the oldest of the 3, and to the bottom right of the screen, you can see the inscriptions that we see in a site called Jabal Ikma, and across the region by the Lihanite civilization from around about 300 years before the Common Era. And then we come to what Al Ula is perhaps best known for, which is actually this slide that I showed you right at the beginning. This is the UNESCO World Heritage Site at Hegra, and it's the southernmost city in the Nabatean kingdom. So we're talking around about the 1st century of the Common Era. And this actually is a picture that was taken in 2020 when we put on a contemporary art performance there by Studio Swine, the Amsterdam-based creative studio, where they used these drones that were mimicking the murmuration of starlings. So this is a kind of a form that you see in nature with flight of birds. Coming back to the slide that I was just showing, the map that you see in the top right here and the picture on the right, you can see the city of Al Ula, or the town, the old town of Al Ula, which was an important resting point on the Incense Road. And the Incense Road is a trade route, an ancient trade route that has existed for at least 5,000 years, that was linked also to the Chinese Silk Road. And this road was the route by which incense was brought from Oman. And I've shown you the map there where you can see, and also incense itself as the material. I wanted to show the material actually because one of the areas of research that has been ongoing in Al Ula for 3 or 4 years now is actually looking into the geology, the pigment, the botany, the actual material, the material culture of Al Ula. And that has actually informed our approach to programming of contemporary art, and indeed even the branding and brand identity of Al Ula. And the medieval Old Town was occupied up until the 1980s, and this was an important stopping point also on another route, which was the Hajj, the pilgrimage route, for pilgrims in particular from the Middle Ages onwards, coming down from the Eastern Mediterranean. So one of the key and important points in all of the approaches that we're taking to creative programming is this idea of the rebirth of a cultural crossroads. We're not treating Al Ula as a tabula rasa. It's more like a field of memories. It's a place that we want to reactivate by working with the local communities. One of the first initiatives in the creation of a new tourist destination, I mean, it's always been a destination in that sense, but after the opening of Saudi Arabia in 2019 to tourism, there's been the work of the Royal Commission for Al Ula has been to develop Al Ula as a tourist destination. And so obviously that entails all the things that you need to do when you have hundreds of thousands of tourists coming. It's the building of hotels. It's the skilling up of the local community in hospitality and hotel management, restaurants, these kinds of things. At the same time, it's working on the social and educational development of the communities themselves, things that you need as the community grows, which includes schools and hospitals and that kind of thing. But in terms of what was done within the Arts and Creative Industries Department, which is where I'm working, we started to train local people. The Bedouin community in particular in Al Ula have always seen themselves as the custodians of the cultural heritage. So we trained what we call the Rawi, the storytellers, and one of the things that I've got a minute to go, so I better carry on quickly on this. But one of the things we did is we took them to the Louvre in Paris to look at how history is talked about there. We took them to Colorado to look at how a very similar geographical location could be talked about. Also in Al Ula, we have this incredible Moriah Concert Hall, and this is the site for international performance activities. This, by the way, is a huge mirrored hall, which is not a render, this picture you're seeing here. This is actually the real thing. And so we have international activities going on here. And we've redeveloped the old town. I can tell you a little bit more about that, including cultural trading, which has been to revive the crafts and artisanship. We have a program running with the Prince's School of Traditional Arts where we're looking at stone carving and these kinds of things. And one of the interesting things is we opened some shops selling new products that tourists might like, that are based on the forms of Al Ula. And we opened them in the off-season, the beginning of May, no tourists, COVID. And the shops have been relatively successful. So we found actually local people are buying the products that we've been developing, which actually it shows how if you develop in the right way, local people will also benefit as well as the tourists that are coming in. In terms of contemporary art programming, there are 3 different strands that I'm looking at. In 2020, we ran Desert X, a installation art, public art initiative in the desert to speak of the desert, bringing contemporary artists like Gisela Colon, who you see here. She's a Californian artist. And this is a partnership with Desert X California. So part of the idea is to look at how contemporary art can express ideas, concerns even, of people who live in desert communities. And often we find that contemporary art is often a very potent way of expressing key issues that a community feels. And those can also be global issues, like issues of sustainability and climate change, for example. So we're currently exploring a new edition of Desert X. And one of the things, or the 2 questions really I wanted to ask is that, how do art and culture fit into a very complex development landscape, which is what we're dealing with in Al Ula, as I've mentioned, gearing up for huge numbers of tourists, welcoming huge numbers of tourists, as Edinburgh has to do every year. We have a season as well. So how can we engage the local communities? And how can we create programs that resonate with those local communities, with local people, also, though, with national audiences and with the global cultural community? The artwork you're seeing here was an installation at Desert X 2020 by Manal Al-Doyan, the Saudi artist, who she wanted to explore the idea of a puddle, a puddle of water. And what that means in a city in the West is something very different in an arid desert landscape where when it rains, it really does rain. And so this piece here is actually called Now You See Me, Now You Don't. So she created a sculptural work that has a very strong formal presence, but at the same time, it really only exists when people come and enjoy and bounce around on these trampolines in the middle of the desert. So I think I've race through these slides really, but I think this is giving a sense of the challenges and approaches that we're taking to artistic programming in Al Ula. I've talked to a lot of artists in my time in Saudi Arabia. I've been there for 2 years now. I've been in this region for nearly 10 years. And one of the things I noticed when you talk to artists from the country is they want international participation. They want international, famous, celebrated, experienced artists to come and work with them. But I completely agree with your point, Antonio, actually about the change of the flow of knowledge and how artists learn from each other. So local artists want that internationalism. They want to be part of a global cultural community. Yet when you talk to visitors, the first thing they're saying is, how Saudi is that artist? Why isn't your art, where's the Arabic inscription on this work by Manal? It doesn't look immediately Arabic. And I'm very keen for the work that I do with artists, whether they're international or local. It's their own expression, it's themselves, it's their complex identity. We all have complex identities, many of us from, like myself, from dual heritage, particularly in Dubai. It's something you see everywhere, isn't it? People have been born in one place, grew up here, have parents from other places. So I think it's important for all artistic programming, whether it's performance or contemporary art, to have that multi-dimensionality to it. And I think it's important also, one of the things I look at in terms of programming Saudi artists is I think it's important for them not to be always told, you have to express who you are as a Saudi. I think it's important that the art itself is of a very high standard and speaks to a range of audiences. And this is what we're striving to do in Al Ula. I do hope that you can all come. We have a strong program lined up. There are 3 or 4 different areas I'm looking at. Contemporary art. I'm working with a very well-known Saudi Arabian collector of contemporary art to exhibit contemporary art in the mirrored Mariah Hall in February next year. Previously, we exhibited Yayo Kasama there. So the point we're making is actually this new generation of Saudi artists, they are the equal of production in any country, anywhere in the world. Actually, that's one of the great pleasures of working in Saudi Arabia right now, is this incredible generation of artists. But one of the things we're doing as well is it's not like the international artists are historical, they have an art history, and your Saudi artist there now. What we try to do, and the exhibition I'm working on right now, has also historical Saudi Arabian works. Saudi Arabian and Emirati artists have a right to exist in art history, and they are historical as well as contemporary. So this idea of the history and the future is important. And by the way, time, long time, geological time is something that you feel and experience very acutely in the landscapes of Al Ula. I'm working at the moment on programming around the idea of incense. I brought a curator from Los Angeles. I'm looking at the countdown here. Is that... Oh, that's the whole thing. Sorry, I thought I had loads more time. Yes. Okay. I was thinking this is not moving very fast. Okay, so I'm looking at 2 things. I'm looking at incense and the sense of smell, and I'm also looking at water and water as a wider theme, and we're commissioning art around that for future cultural assets that will be exploring those areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I'm going to stand for our Q&A session now so that I can see this part of the audience. Thanks so much, panelists. That was really a wonderful set of insights and inputs to today's session. I think just closing on the comment you made and our earlier discussion before we started, this business of long time versus newness, perhaps, and the drive to construct agendas, I suppose, predicated around notions of world-class city, cultural capitals, and all of that kind of stuff, is a driver for city making, of course. But the business of patience, time, hesitation, not as the negative, but as a moment to speculate and remain sensitive to the adding to, as opposed to the driving forward and potentially sometimes and often erasing, is, I think, central to everybody's cause here today and reflections. Thank you very much for your attendance and for your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.